you need to find where you slot in, because there's always a spot. Like, no matter what your skill is, whatever your expertise is, in these sorts of mass movements where you're trying to change the world, really, everyone has a role, no matter what your skill set is. And it's finding, and then also then not overreaching, right? Like for me, I can't do some things because they're just not in my area of expertise. So it's more about, if I have access to those or whatever, trying to get other, nurture other folks or open those for other folks who do have those skills to do that. So also, having the humility or whatever to be self-aware around, like, I'm not going to fight the government in court. Like, that's not where I'm going to, but I can do this other thing. And I think everyone has that opportunity. And I think it's in teaching, certainly from the Anishinaabe perspective, as far as I understand, like, you engage sort of on the terms that where you can do the most effect. You don't overstretch, you don't. And so I think for me, that's art. That's been arts and storytelling, and trying to make sure that we have our space in the sort of colonial milieu of narrative.
Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater, and I'm the host of this show, The Warrior Life. I'm a lawyer, professor, author, and activist from River First Nation, and my motto is education for action on Indigenous rights, social justice, and protecting the planet. And on this podcast, you get an education of a totally different kind. It's one that's enriched by the cultures and lived experiences and all of the activism and advocacy, resistance, resurgence, revitalization of Indigenous peoples all over North America. But I'm feeling a bit unreconciled today, and I just can't figure out why. So maybe you should stay tuned and see what this is all about. Welcome back to the Warrior Life podcast. I'm your host, Pam Palmater, and today I get to talk to such an amazing person. He has a radio voice, he has a radio mic, he's literally going to be perfect for this podcast. I get to talk to this amazing award-winning journalist. He is a broadcaster, he's a public speaker, he's an award-winning author, he's an arts guy. He's already done so much in his really, really young life. And I'm sure all of you know him in one way or another. So in addition to his award-winning book, Unreconciled, which we'll talk about, you've probably heard him on CBC's Radio Metro Morning as a film critic and a culture critic, and I want to hear all about that. And perhaps you've read his work as a columnist in numerous media outlets or guest on TV shows and some of my favorite documentaries. And he's programmed one of my favorite festivals of all. It's the Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival, and of course, those in the festival biz, Real World Film Festival. But I think perhaps best of all, and you'll see this if you go on his website, he owns a dog. And so for us dog people, you can't get any better than that. So thank you so much for coming on the show, and welcome, Jesse.
Hi, Pam. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm so thrilled. I was almost hoping I would see the little puppy walk by, but at least we get to see a pitch on your website.
Yeah, I think he's hiding where as we record, we're having a bit of a storm where I am. Yeah. I think he's sheltering somewhere in the house.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, mine are in the basement too because it's storming as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into the interrogation, and I have got a billion questions for you, perhaps you could just introduce yourself, your community, where you come from.
Sure, happy to. My name is Jesse Wente. I was born and raised in Toronto. My dad's side of the family comes from Chicago in the U.S. and are very much American. I think that's how they would describe themselves. And then my mom's side of the family comes from Genaabaajing Anishinaabek, which is known as Serpent River First Nation by the government on the north shore of Lake Huron, of which I'm a member of Serpent River. And yeah, I'm Bear Clan, and my family name is Wente and Miyawasagi on my mom's side. And yeah, I think that's about as best I can do as an introduction.
That's awesome. Love Serpent River. They have great powwows. They have great gatherings, and they all spread out to the different powwow circuit. And I just love seeing people from Serpent River. So it's so fantastic that you are one of those. Um, there's this question I get asked literally on every podcast, and if I don't ask it, I get in trouble. But
Hmm.
young people always want to know, how did we get from little tiny kid to where we are today? Because so many youth think, oh, you have to have everything planned out. It's got to be step by step, or you can't do the things you want to do. So my question to you is, when you were 5 years old, did you know you wanted to be a writer and a broadcaster and a film critic and all the things you do?
No, no, not when I was 5. I'm 50 now. I'm not sure I know that that's what I want to do now, even. But uh, no, as a kid, my main interest was movies. For sure. My parents took me to see the original Star Wars movie when I was 3. It was the first film I would have seen in theaters, and they took me to this fabulous old theater. It was the University Cinema on Bloor Street in Toronto, which was an
Wow.
old-fashioned sort of movie palace, of which they don't really make them that way anymore. And I was completely obsessed from that moment with Star Wars, certainly, as a kid, but movies, also just the wider world of movies. Star Wars is very much a gateway to cinema at large, because it's so much of it is taken from other movies, or is referencing other films, so that if you're inquisitive in that way, which I was, it can really lead you down some very interesting pathways as a starting off point. And my mother, Connie, was very indulgent as a parent, and at least in terms of that sort of intellectual pursuit. So she also liked movies. She had grown up. She would always tell the stories of going to cinemas where you could, get in for a quarter and watch the movies all
Oh, yeah.
and stop, and all that stuff. So she was heavily into movies. So it was sort of like she found someone who she could indulge her own passion with. And so I got to just watch a lot of stuff as a kid. There was very little guardrails in terms of, my parents were hippies. They are of the 60s, of that generation. So for them, the idea that the ratings or those sorts of ideas around were not really a thing. Like, they had their own sort of guidelines, but they weren't so interested in what society
Yeah.
or the government had to say. So I got to see all sorts of stuff that would have been, too grown up necessarily. But she also, Pam, I would say, was really key. The reason I think I was able to do that is my mom had experience as a teacher, young kids, was in
Mhm.
the PTA, and I would say, what she sort of gave me a very early media literacy education as a very small child,
Wow.
just in terms of, I vividly remember her saying, listen, it's on a screen, it's fake, like it's been manipulated. So whatever you're seeing on a screen, know that someone chose to put that on a screen, and in that choice is all sorts of other choices that happen. And so even when I would
Mm,
see stuff
yeah.
that were like scary movies for a kid, um I remember the only one I was truly scared of was Indiana Jones, which I now suspect was more about the colonialism than anything else. But I watched like Alien, for example, like very
Yeah.
young, as a young kid, very scary movie. But I was always fascinated more with the how they did that. Like, I understood that
Oh.
the alien wasn't real, so there was nothing really to be that afraid of it. And so I was more interested in how you get the alien on screen, or how you
Mm.
make the spaceship go, or how you get Darth Vader to sort of sound like that. And that was really the first, so in terms of career path, or like the path my life would end up taking, I became obsessed with movies. That became the passion. And then I didn't really know what else to do. Like by the time I got to the point where you're going to university, or starting to make sort of more adult choices,
Yeah.
all I knew was movies, really. And that's what I had spent all of my youth doing. And so I went to be in movies, and I didn't even know what that was. You're
Wow.
talking about the early 90s. The only Indigenous person in the movies, other than the people on screen,
Mm.
and of course, like most Indigenous people or First Nations people, most of those movies that we were watching at that time had us dying on
Yeah.
screen. It was mostly what we did on screen. There weren't that many sort of models in what I was interested in, which was not so much the on-screen part. I dabbled in acting when I was a kid. Like I did pursue a little bit of that, but I was always really more interested in who got to make all those decisions. And it became very clear to me that, at least in the film world, like the director, producer, the right, like that area, those are the folks that actually got to make all the decisions in terms of what ended up on screen.
Oh.
But even, and so at the time there was, Alanisa Bomsawin at the NFB.
Mhm.
That would have been close to about it. Like there weren't too many at that time. I would have just begun to be aware of like Merita Mita, out of the Maori filmmaker.
Oh.
It's like some of that. I wasn't even aware of the Sami films, done from the north yet. So because at the time movies were much less accessible than they are today. We forget that it was, if you wanted to see those, you would have had to attend the film festival they played.
Mhm.
Otherwise, that was
Mhm.
it. So for me, I went to film school, like the U of T, to study cinema studies, because I figured I
Oh.
wanted to learn why movies were good, like why some were good and some were bad, primarily, and then apply that to making movies. And while I was at U of T, I met a woman who's now been my wife, and we've been together for more than 30
Oh.
years.
Wow.
And I saw, well, she actually saw a job posting to do a summer internship at the CBC. And at
Wow.
that moment, it was either that or I was going to go back to driving a forklift, which is what I had done most of the summers up until then. And I went, well, this is, yeah, exactly. And it's like, well, I know I didn't really want to drive a forklift for much longer. And this was in media. It wasn't movies, but it was in media. I gave it a shot. I remember at the time they said they only had 4 applicants, which I think speaks to so much in terms of where we were as
Yeah.
a broader community. They make this sort of opportunity, which we do a lot nowadays. Indigenous
Yeah.
folks create these sorts of opportunities, and these days we get a fair amount of applications. But back then, I remember there was 4, so no wonder I got it. And then that's how I ended up, being on the radio and everything. Because once I was in the CBC, I didn't go back to school. Like I didn't go to learn how to make movies, which was sort of the
Oh.
second stage. I ended up getting the job at the CBC and staying there for a while, and that ultimately became my avenue into the business.
That's really insightful because when you look at, say, some of today's most prominent Indigenous activists, and I ask them about their background, they grew up in an activist family. So, always going to protests or rallies or community information sessions. So, even though it might not have been in their mind, this is my pursuit, this is what I'm going to do. When you're around it and influenced by it so much, it clearly, obviously, if you're being able to watch movies at a very young age, the kind of movies I would never have been able to watch until I was 16. There was just this hard line, no horror movies, no sci-fi movies, no adult movies. It had to be pretty much Walt Disney movies or that's it. So that's great that you did that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think those influences do really do shape you. For me, the activist part came later. I think with
Mhm.
my family, my parents were of the 60s, so they certainly did their fair share of protesting and those sorts of movements. Um, but they stopped, as I think some portion of that generation did stop protesting. I think mostly because they had kids. They had me. My mom was only 20. My dad would have been 21. So they had me really young, and they just then became family people. And in terms of my own family, because my grandmother was the one who went to my mom's mom was the one who went to residential school, and is the reason why we were in Toronto in the first place, why my mom grew up in Toronto and was there to meet my dad and all of that sort of stuff. um you know I the I think it took a moment, like in terms of the activation or that getting back involved with community, because my grandmother was still very connected to Serpent River. Went there. She has siblings that are still there, or were there. Um, but she was also the one that had suffered like the big trauma in the family from her experience, and so she died still a Catholic. So she had really taken on all those things. It was her children that's really started to get,
Mhm.
how would I put it? Got angry about what had happened, because my grandmother, it was more. I don't know if anger was necessarily the emotion. Um, it was, I think, other emotions for her. But I think her kids got angry, and likewise, for me, it came later, and it was really sort of an application, my mom made it very clear, because we had I led a fairly privileged life, certainly in relation to lots of folks broader in our community, and even in relation to other folks in my family, because of my dad's side of the family. um but she had always made it very clear, as I write in the book, that, like, yeah, you're going to have this privileged life, which includes like going to film school. Like, I considered all that part of it, but there will be a point when you have to turn back and give back as much as you can to your community, as much as you've learned. And what I've come to understand is this was very much the philosophy of my great grandparents. It would have been my mom's grandparents, who she was quite close to. And she would visit them during the summer. She would take the Greyhound bus up to the community and spend the summers there, because they had very, very much believed that, like, in order to survive colonialism, really, that their family had to learn the new ways, like
Yeah.
they had to learn how to be successful in order to help the community sort of move forward. And so my mom, who did not go to university and sort of grew a career as a corporate person, starting out as a secretary until she was like a vice president.
Wow.
What I watched with her was that, like, when she got to a certain point, she started working on a lot of boards, a lot of board of directors. Like, that's how she sort of found the best way to give back. And she sort of introduced that to me through her friends that she had met doing that work. And so as a young person, that's what I ended up doing. I ended up joining boards of directors of, Native Earth Performing Arts or Imaginative, or when we were, frankly, when I think back, all of the boards at that time were really young. We were all very young people starting out in our careers, but trying to very much give back and build things that would endure. And so that's when that started. And the protests, I think, like so many people who go to university or sort of high
Mhm.
school, and in the late 80s and 90s, you get a little bit activated. So all of that started for me as a teenager, listening to Public Enemy, for example, and finding some community in their righteous indignation, and recognizing that, we had a lot to work out in terms of our own community, and a lot of struggle left
Mhm.
to go. And so I've always viewed it as, like, part of the privilege is that I have to help give back. So I've certainly tried to embody the same philosophy that my great grandparents had, that I think my grandmother, in her way, as best she could, did, and my mom and certainly did.
It's incredible how all the people that I talk to, and it doesn't matter what their background experience was, they all have a different path to where they are today now, writing about Native issues, talking about it, being in movies, being an active. Like, it's all different ways in which they've come to be there with the same kinds of different teachings. It could have been their father, could have been their mother, it could have been their great grandfather saying, do this, do that. And I think that's really telling about our obligation, for the next generation to be able to say, here's what we've done. Here's your relatively privilege. Like, it's always relative, right? Relative to previous generations. And here's what you need to do to give back. I remember my brother telling me when he asked me what I was going to do one weekend, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to go volunteer." And he's like, "What? What's volunteering?" And I had no idea what he was talking about. And I was like, I'm gonna I'm gonna go work at the Native Friendship Center. And he's like, that's not volunteering, right? Like, that's a part of being in the community.
Mm,
Those are your
mm.
responsibility. There's no such thing as volunteering for us. And I was like, it makes you think about it differently. So I had much older siblings, and they made me sit on every board, like nonprofit boards,
Yeah,
whether it
yeah.
was women's organizations, kids, Native friendship centers, off reserve housing, health board, like you name it. I had no experience, no knowledge, nothing. But I was sitting around these boards with a whole bunch of other people who were in similar situations, just trying to make things move forward. So I think actually being on board of directors, as colonial as it sounds, for our Native organizations, that makes a huge impact, I find.
Well, I mean, I hope so. It's nice of you to say. I mean, I think
Mhm,
it's part of what we have to do.
mhm,
It's
yeah,
I because I think we also need to do all the other parts that
yeah,
are. But I think it's unfortunately, I think unfortunately is the correct way to look at it. But like, unfortunately, in this era, or this moment of colonialism, in terms of its cycle, um, it does behoove us to be both in and out, to be both within
yeah,
the system itself, as painful, and I do speak from experience, as
mhm,
painful, as difficult as it is to do that, and as how would I put it, like, undesirable, because I'm not sure we want to necessarily do that, but I think it is something that essentially we have to do.
yeah,
And then I also think we have to be outside of it, and maybe mostly outside of it, in terms of our communities, in order to push, and sort of you push from both sides in
mhm,
order to try to make this better. And I've always viewed the sort of give back as, like, part of it is also to do it within your capacity. So, like,
yeah,
for me, I'm a movie geek. I can't
yeah,
help that. Like, that happened long before I could do anything about it. Like, it was over as soon as that spaceship went over my head at 3 in that movie theater. Like, so much of what I was going to be interested in for the rest of my life happened in that second. So there's not much I can do about that. But in terms of how I apply that to the movement or the struggle, like where my positionality then is, well, like, for me, then it was obvious that fighting for our stories, or like, that's the arena where I can be of service, and stories sort of in the broadest possible sense, not just film, but like the narrative possibilities, and our ability to control our own narrative and influence larger narratives, whatever. That was going to be where I could apply whatever my skill set was going to be, whatever my experience was going to be. Like, my sister, she's a lawyer,
mhm,
and you know it's perfect, right? She's great at arguing, so she should be like, that's a great application. So I think it's, to me, those are both just examples of, like, you need to find where you slot in, because there's always a spot. Like, no matter
Yeah.
what your skill is, whatever your expertise is, in these sorts of mass movements where you're trying to change the world, really, everyone has a everyone has a role, no matter what your skill set is, and it's finding, and then also then not overreaching, right? Like for
Mm.
me, I can't do some things because they're just not in my area of expertise. So it's more about, if I have access to those or whatever, trying to get other, nurture other folks, or open those for other folks who do have those skills to do that. So also, having the humility or whatever to be self-aware around, like, I'm not going to fight the government in court. Like, that's not
Mhm.
where I'm going to, but I can do this other thing. And I think everyone has that opportunity. And I think it's in teaching, certainly from the Anishinaabe perspective, as far as I understand, like, you engage sort of on the terms that where you can do the most effect. You don't overstretch, like you don't,
Mm.
and so I think for me, that's art. That's been arts and storytelling, and trying to make sure that we have our space in the sort of colonial milieu of narrative,
Mhm.
um, and that also we're able to move their narrative space. Quite frankly, to expand it, so that this reality that we are all currently live in can become a little bit more hospitable, and maybe we can find a way out of it.
It's such a good way of looking at it because I get so many questions from youth or when I go to high schools and they're worried that, "Oh, well, if I'm not a lawyer, I can't be in the fight." Or if I'm not doing this, if I don't know how to organize protests, well, I can't be in the fight. And, what you're saying is whatever it is you choose to do, there's always a way to push for Indigenous inclusion and Indigenous difference and all of the ways in which we have effectively make space, because it's not always just going to be opened up, right? And it's people like you who are really pushing it. I mean, you have done so much in the art space, and I want to talk to you about that. What it's like when you're heading up the Canada Council for the Arts or the Indigenous Screen Office. These are huge things. And for people who don't know, I mean, there's the Indigenous Screen Office, but Canada Council for the Arts, that's not an Indigenous organization. So for you to be leading the way, that's pretty significant.
Yeah, I mean, I would be the first to say I'm the chair. So, in the way these structures, as the chair is like the chair. I don't. The CEO is the CEO, and
Yeah, yeah.
there's very different roles. I've been both, not at the Canada Council, but I've been both in my life. I've
Mhm.
served both of those roles, but they are quite different. I mean, for me, the Canada Council, I became a board member in 2017. I did not have becoming a board member of a crown corporation on my lifelong bingo card of things I would do, Pam, because it is um, odd, I think, or at least certainly outside the norm, because there hasn't been an Indigenous chair of a crown before, a federal crown anyway, before. Um, but even just as for us, I think it is an uncomfortable spot to necessarily to serve in that way. But I think for me, the Canada Council sort of demonstrated a willingness and an ability to evolve and to shift, because as you pointed out, it is definitely not an Indigenous organization. I mean, if you look at its founding, it was absolutely a tool of colonialism used against us, as so many of the institutions are. And but it's trying to it under but it both understands that institutionally and is trying to recover, like trying to. And so I have time for that. I have time
Mhm.
for helping. I don't know how much more time I have for that. That's been a lot of my career, but I think there's value in that. And then with this Indigenous Screen Office, of which I'm no longer CEO. Important to point out, but like, you know, when that was started, and I should always point out, it was started really as a community effort, right? Lots of people advocated for that. Marcia Nickerson wrote like the main documents and helped organize, you know, so lots of people really had a role in the founding of that. But you know, that was really an exercise, or not an exercise, but an attempt, or a journey to create our own space. So, you know, I look at my career as a combination of working within colonial institutions to try to create space for us within those, to try to make them more hospitable. Because while I don't think we necessarily want inclusion in them, I think we should be able to safely navigate them, which hasn't always been true. And likewise, build our own thing, right? Like, so a lot of my, you know, quote unquote volunteer, as you point out, not volunteer, but that work, that outside, that extracurricular, if you want to put it in the sort of capitalist, like the stuff I did beyond the paycheck, was all for Indigenous organizations, really. And that was because I wanted, at the same time that I'm working with the colonial system, I wanted to build our own stuff. And so the Screen Office was really that, like, to me, the pinnacle of what I could do is help create this organization that like can serve us on our own terms, you know, for us. And it doesn't really worry that much about those things. And it can also offer a place for the next generation of like arts leaders and whatnot to maybe learn some things and grow, and which I hope all of that. I think it'll have a great future. Carrie Swanson, who runs it, is a brilliant person. She's doing an amazing job, and I'm sure it will. But it was definitely that bifurcation, you know, that like, and what I've come as a middle-aged man now, who's lived through all of this, I think that's really I guess the point that I have found, or the purpose that I have found for my life, which is, you know, I'm an Anishinaabe guy who's born in the city, who's born, you know, separated from his community, separated from the land and the culture and all of that stuff that would normally fill me. So much of that I've had to do as an adult, and fluent in a language that isn't mine, really. Right. But what's the purpose of that? And I would say, looking through the lens of my great grandparents, I would say the purpose is to be that person who's sort of in between. Like that is, and it's not the most comfortable, not always the most comfortable spot, as I write a lot about in the book, that can lead to a lot of discomfort. But in a way, I've actually come to a place where I'm quite comfortable with that actually being the spot. Like that is, I'm here to be able to navigate those spaces, but trying always in my mind as an Anishinaabe person, with our futures in mind. So that's, and I think that's okay. Like I've come to really, I struggled a long time, Pam, and this is really what my next book is about, is coming to be okay with the fact that like, this is how I'm going to be Anishinaabe. That like I can't be the same Anishinaabe my great grandparents were. It's just not that time.
No.
And I'm not them. And in point of fact, they were preparing, like they wanted someone, like their whole point was to produce someone like me, and then someone like my kids, and so on and so forth. Like that's, so I'm living in their intentions. And so like that's important. And like that, and I think it's also come to understand that our communities, because my family wasn't alone, my community wasn't alone, I think this is actually quite widespread, really did a lot of future planning while they were going through some really horrible things. And I take a lot of solace in this moment, because there's so much horrible things going on in the world, but like it is a moment when actually you can think of the future, as even though it's so hard, and think, okay, like 2 generations, 3 generations, what does this, like what can we do now that will put us in a place where we can recover, knowing that like we're not, like the recovery that our communities are doing from colonialism is ongoing. It's, and like it will outlive me. Like we will
Yeah.
still be doing it when I'm gone. But how do we always be working towards the eventuality that we will recover from it, that we
Mhm.
will be whole again, and that all of these stuff, all the troubles that our people have, all the struggles that we have, are just part of the pathway back to being whole again. And
Mhm.
while it's tough for those of us who live through it, because maybe you and I don't get to be
Yep.
whole, right?
Yep.
But the idea is like it is the journey to get our communities back to there. And I'm a big
Yep.
believer that is the end of the journey. And
Mhm. Mhm.
we will get back to there. And that part of how we do that, unfortunately, is a lot of the stuff we're going through right now. But to always keep in mind, it's the moment. It's not forever. And we
That's
can be
true.
too quick to think this crisis is what will be forever. It's like, no, there was a
Mm.
time when we didn't face these things. There will be a time when we don't face them in the future.
It's such a positive message, one that I've heard from elders all over. Because I would ask, "Why aren't you just completely devastated and disillusioned and sitting in despair?" And they give the same answers that you do. Clearly you've talked to elders around, well, it hasn't always been this way. We were here for tens of thousands of years. This is a blip in our bigger ancestral experience, and that we'll get to the other side, and all the ways in which we struggle, which is different and the same. Like, different in the sense that maybe someone had to live off reserve because of sex discrimination in the Indian Act. Maybe someone went to residential school, but ultimately it's the same in the sense that we've all been impacted by colonization in one way or another. We all struggle with that and not feel whole enough, connected enough, native enough, Anishinabek enough, Mi'kmaq enough. Like, it's the world, society tells us, has set us up to believe we're just not enough. So just give up. Please just assimilate and give up. And so I love that. And it makes me want to talk about your book, because for
Hmm.
anyone who hasn't read it, it's called Unreconciled: Family, Truth, and Indigenous Resistance. So now just pretend there are people listening to this podcast who have not yet read your book, but I
Yeah.
know they will after this podcast. Can you talk a little bit more about what's in it? I know you've talked a little bit about it, but kind of, like the main thrust of what's in here?
So the book's my publisher likes to call it a memoir manifesto. So it's about my life. So it's a bit about like where I came from and how I sort of navigated life. So you get a little bit of my childhood and all of that, um, and then through the professional career. But I would also say it's about I really, and I think this is true of the next book I'm writing and true of the work I did on the radio and all sorts of stuff, even the film reviews, quite frankly. Like I try to also present some analysis, particularly around politics, reconciliation, those sorts of things, through using the lens of my life and my experience as a way into those things, just like I would around movies or any sort of other things. And I think it's important, Pam, as context, that the book came about. I was asked to write the book in sort of late 2017. This is after, and it took me 4 years to write. So if you're wondering why, it didn't come out till 2021, that's why. Um, but and I was asked in the context at the time, if you remember that particular year, that was Canada's sesquicentennial year, which was whatever it made it an unpleasant year, I think, for a lot of First Nations folks. But and I was still very much on the radio, which I'm not really anymore, but I was still very much on the radio on Metro Morning, and a number of issues came up. And over the course of my radio career, I stopped being a film critic at one point. Well, at a very specific point when I started to run a movie theater is when I stopped being a film critic because of the obvious conflict of interest. So when I started running when I took the job to run the TIFF movie theater for the Toronto International Film Festival, their movie theater, which was when I took the job wasn't yet real. It was just a hole in the ground still, basically. I think the foundation had maybe been laid, but anyway. I stayed on CBC Radio. The column for Metro Morning was quite popular, and so they wanted me to stay around. And we basically decided I could really write about whatever I wanted. And it turns out increasingly what I wanted to write about was issues that were important to our community, and I thought needed addressing. I had not, I think for a lot of people that had listened to me for many years on CBC Radio, for certainly for the first decade that I was on the radio, you could have absolutely gone not knowing that I was Indigenous. I had the same voice, but it just didn't come up. Like Hollywood wasn't making Western, like it was just not, it wasn't like for my on-air stuff. Behind the scenes, they would have known because I was producing shows and booking, I had always was trying to get Indigenous folks on the radio, but on the air would have been nothing. And then Avatar, basically all of it happened there was a couple of things that happened. I took the job at TIFF and Avatar came out, which was right around the same time, 2009, I think. And in the reviewing of Avatar, it sort of became obvious because I couldn't review that movie I couldn't find a way to review that movie other than as an Indigenous person. And obviously I reviewed every movie as an Indigenous person, but that one, it actually was, it came up because my perspective was going to be radically different than any other critics as it was. And so that was the moment the audience heard that I was Indigenous. So for Metro Morning, I had been writing about a bunch of different stuff by that point. And in 2017, you had the sesquicentennial, you had the whole thing around cultural appropriation, which became a big issue in the country at that time. And you had just had the whole brouhaha around mascots, and all this stuff was happening. And I was a columnist who was writing pieces and doing pieces on the radio about this sort of stuff, and pieces that ended up being, quite popular. And that's what really it convinced me that I could write a book, or that I had something to say in a book, because I had been offered before and hadn't known what I would say exactly in a book. And also I think the publishers figured out, hey, maybe this guy actually has a whole book that we could write. And so in terms of the book, you get a lot of my life, and then a lot of stuff around Canada and the state of truth and reconciliation. Obviously with the title, you can guess what I think of that state. And, it gets quite manifesto-y, or, in it, in terms of the tone of it. And so that's what people can expect. I think I tried to be as close as I could to listening to me on the radio, which proved to be much harder because the radio's live, and I didn't really have to think about it in the same way as when you try to make that sound like that in a book. But you'll get sort of the story of me and my family, at least the Indigenous side of my family to some degree, and really how I've come to see, for me, it was important to say, well, this is how I see things, but to explain how I came to those opinions. And a lot of it just has to do with my life and experiencing things, and that, and with everyone, that sort of forms your outlook on some of the larger issues that we all face together.
It's one of those things that I find as Native people we all do. So if we're a grad student, we situate ourselves in the research. You make those statements ahead of time. Or if you're in art, if you're making documentaries, there's always this way of, okay, here's how you will better understand me. I'm going to situate my context and my family and my experiences so that whatever I write about could be about the movie Alien. You'll get from where I'm coming from. And so my question, though, is, so I read this and I thought, you know what? This is ripe for part 2. Maybe the reconciled version. Is there a part 2 potentially in the future?
I mean, yes is the short answer. Probably, I don't know. At this point, I'm a little confused around what I'm allowed to say and what I'm not allowed to say.
Ah.
But yes, I think it's fair to say, because lots of folks in our community know, because like, yeah, I'm working on the next one. I'm not sure. The title isn't Reconciled.
No.
Um, no, I think that one will have to be saved as a potential part 3 and as a long shot potential
Yeah.
part 3, because of course the Unreconciled that I'm talking about is both the country and like
Yeah.
its relationship, but also was me.
Mhm.
Was that I was a bit unreconciled with myself and what it meant to be, Anishinaabe in 2020,
Mhm.
take your pick. Uh, so the next book will be a sequel. Like, I think that's fair to say.
Mhm.
Probably shouldn't say much more than that,
No,
but
no, no.
and it will take a very, I was about to say very similar form. It's going to take exactly the same form, Pam. Like, not very similar. This is my form. This is how I tell the stories. It's how I do this work. And I, for me, I've always found it a way to gain connection with audiences that sometimes don't have my history, don't have the shared history, but we're trying to move things. And so, like, telling the human stories it's why I've always been a big believer in story, and a big
Mhm.
believer is because I don't think, I just know from my life, having watched movies, so many movies, and read, had so many stories come into my brain. I can see a story from a life and a world that I have zero experience with.
Mhm.
And yet it can totally transform how I understand my own being, my relations, everything. So I think that's why we should always be telling stories, and
Yeah.
why, in fact, this is why humans are the storytelling sort of animal, is because for us this is very central. So yes, it'll be very similar. I think you'll get, if you like this one, you'll like it. Hopefully, I'm working on it. And it will reflect. I will say it's. I had thought the first one was really hard, and it was really hard.
Mhm.
This one's harder, and it's frankly because of some of the things I've been through that I'll discuss in the book.
Yeah.
Just since that book came out, like since that time, it's for
Wow.
relatively recent stuff. But also, I think it's just. But I also hope it's meant to reflect the healing that I've also done. That
Oh,
I
good.
that
Yeah.
and the whole reason I'm able to write this book is because of the healing I've done, and hopefully that will help some other folks to recognize that we can all heal, even as we struggle, even as we engage in the struggle, even as we are
Mhm.
part of the movement. And I've come to see all of this anyway as healing. This whole thing that we're in
Yeah.
is a healing thing. We're trying to get our communities healed.
Mhm.
And so truth and reconciliation should be a healing process. It should be. I'm not, you and I could probably have a whole discussion whether that's actually happening, but like in an ideal world, that it would be like that it would heal everyone. And I wanted to say on one of the other points about, how colonialism has all affected us.
Mhm.
One of the other things that I've really come to accept, not just understand, but accept, is also how much colonial damage is done to the folks that benefit the most from it as well. Like,
Yeah.
yes, we are
Yeah.
obviously like the frontline victims, like we're where the most harm sort of gets exerted. But the reality is, speaking with folks who you would think and who do benefit from colonialism the most, they also are struggling with the same systems and parameters that it has established, because the truth with colonialism and its other systems is they're not about like their stated goals of like freedom and equality. Like, they're just not about those things. And so ultimately, even for those that benefit, it's not about those things for them, for the vast majority of them, right? It's just not. And so, in fact, like, for example, the one of the things I'll talk about in a new book, but like, and we all know this, but like the scarcity that is imposed on First Nations people is horrendous, right? Like, and none of it existed before. So it's a relatively new thing that we are scarce in resources. We were not pre-colonization. But the truth is that colonization even has scarcity for those that would benefit from it. Like even now we're seeing it doesn't actually share enough wealth or anything, other resources all after taking it all. It doesn't actually spread them around in any way that helps like even its own system in for long-term survival. Like it just funnels everything to a very select few. And so like even, and this is why I understand, like you talk about like white privilege, like these sorts of very academic sort of notions, and you have lots of white people say not me. They're not wrong in some sense, but they're also wrong in that, like, well, there is a privilege, but the reality is the system that privileges you won't even privilege you enough. Like it's such a pyramid that unless you're right at the top of it, you don't you end up being a victim, not as I don't want to get into scales of victimhood. The reality is all of us would benefit from the overthrow of these systems, and it would also free a lot of the folks who benefit the most. It would free them to also understand a different way to live, like to stop being trapped. I think this is why we see so many folks, like so much renewed discussion of freedom within these systems by folks who you're like, you're totally free. Like, I don't know what, you know what I'm talking about. Like but it's because these systems don't actually provide enough for everyone.
No.
So they are seeking freedom, but they're, sadly, I think we're confused about which direction freedom actually is. And I don't mean a right left or any sort of political nonsense. I mean, I'm thinking about it as if we are all under a giant weighted blanket, and some ends are sealed and some ends have a way out. And sadly, I think some of us think the way they get stuck at the sealed end, like they think that, and it just isn't. It's actually, we have to, there is air, there is a way to get out and breathe again, but it requires like it requires this reality. Because the more I think about it, I really view colonialism as like a reality that is imposed. It's a whole reality. We need to escape this. This is the blanket, and that's going to take a lot of time. But we're all trapped under it. Like it's not benefiting. It's only benefiting just so small a group of people that of course it's unsustainable. And I think, I had been really hopeful that the pandemic, it's sad to be hopeful about a pandemic. Such a tragedy on a global way. But there was that moment where I think a lot of us were like, maybe people will see the sunlight from under the blanket. Like maybe this, I don't think they did in the end, or we didn't see it for long enough to truly get there, or maybe people pressed. I don't know. I think a lot of things happened.
Yeah.
But I was sort of hopeful that maybe that would, because the reality is, how do I want to say this? Like, I think a lot of the democracies we're seeing, these so-called democracies, are headed for real trouble in the next few years. And I think that's because people are seeking the solution. They're trying to get out from under the blanket, and they're headed into the part that actually just seals you in.
Yeah.
And I get it I get the frustration. But I think it's a real danger, and I wish we could. I think it's why, to circle it back, it's why for me stories are so important, because I think we're going to have to tell some stories to get people to see where the light is. And I hoped, maybe stories are failing, because like I had hoped maybe stories would be enough to prevent people from having to experience certain things for themselves to understand. But it feels like maybe they really need to experience, and which is terrible, because like it will be bad for it's not like it's not will be just one election cycle. Like it will, the harms will really radiate, and you want people to learn. I would hope people, one of the lessons that people would have of colonialism is to look at our experience of it and not to repeat it for themselves. And yet, it sort of seems maybe that's inevitable. And anyway, I didn't, that went on a depressing side. I didn't mean to do
No,
that.
no, no.
All of it to circle back to just like, I think for me, healing, like we have to be
Yeah.
able to heal ourselves, heal our communities, because it's only with healing that we're actually going to be able to take the deep breaths, that we're going to
Mhm.
be able to get to that fresh air and move ourselves past the claustrophobia of this sort of this era.
It's so true, and I like what you say about stories. Stories tell the story of what happened to us. It tells the story of us, it tells the story of why it happened, tells the story of how we are fighting against, colonialism, how we're winning, how we have we can create our future, how we can help other people get out from colonialism, which maybe it worked for decades and decades and decades, but that system doesn't work forever. And now you have a whole new generation of kids who basically have resigned themselves to the fact that they could never, ever buy a home, ever, 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 with anywhere near the kind of salary that they're going to make in whatever profession it is. And it's like, wait a second, wasn't that what they always taught us? You go to school, get a job, buy a house, get a car, have family, go on vacation. And now you're telling a whole generation, yeah, except you guys. No, you guys can't do that because we still need to hold it up here in this like whatever 1% or whatever actual percent it is. So I really like that you've got hope through stories, and stories are healing, and there's stories of healing, and that's a really positive thing. And I think it's a good message for any young people who are listening. And just before we sign off,
Yeah.
if there was a young person who came to you and said, I want to do what you do, I want to write, I want to tell stories, but I'm worried that I don't have the skill, or I don't have the ability, or I don't have, whatever it is they think they don't have. Do you have any advice for them?
Sure. First, I would say I'm actually, it's one of the other places I find hope is in young people,
Mhm,
because it seems to me maybe they're not as resigned as we thought,
mhm,
given some
mhm.
certain things we're seeing on campuses and whatnot. That maybe they're not as resigned, and that's good.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be as resigned, and folks of my generation should not take offense that they won't be resigned. We should,
Mhm.
the Gen Xers should all remember that, like, no, we're good with this part of it. Like this anyway, I hope
Yeah.
we can remember
Yeah.
that we didn't want to be resigned in that way, and we should leave space for other kids. In terms of what I would say is, I would say if you want to, I don't, I don't quite know what it would mean to do what I do, because I'm not sure I know what that means. It's a variety of weird things. What I would say is be open. So I understand what you're passionate about, and I truly mean passionate. Like what could you do that doesn't feel like work? And I mean
Mm.
that in the broadest way, because you're going to have to work regardless, because that's
Yeah.
life. But like, I mean, in the broadest possible way, what is passionate about you? And sometimes when you're young, it can be quite narrow. And I would say, sure, like for me, it was movies, but I approached the broadness being I was interested in movies, in being in the movie business, and that was broad enough where I could be a film critic and not the filmmaker.
Mhm.
Or I could be the film curator at a festival and not the direct. Like, there's a pathway through all of that, and if you're open to those possibilities, be open to the stuff that of experimenting, because I would also say part of my journey was I was open to doing like the board work that,
Mhm.
for a lot of people who do board work, it's like something to do for your resume. It was never that for me.
Mhm.
What it turned out to be, though, is it gave me a lot of experiences that I wouldn't have otherwise had. So like when it came to being running, say, a movie theater, or running like a huge
Mhm.
portion of a big not-for-profit like a TIFF, the only reason they hired me, it wasn't because I was a film critic. There was a bunch of film critics that they could have hired.
Mhm.
There weren't a bunch of film critics who'd also had experience hiring people, running a organization, applying for grants, doing budget, submitting, doing all of this
Yeah.
other stuff. That's what allowed that to happen, right? And so being open to all of that. I'll give you some advice a former Grand Chief gave me that I hold very dear, that has been very valuable to me, which is work with the willing. Don't worry about the unwilling. And
Mm.
the way I've always taken this, and it's been how I've
Mm.
worked, which is if you're coming from where our community generally is coming from, which is we tend to naturally be, and maybe this is true, like I'm often described as like a disruptor or like a change maker or these sorts of things. And it's true, because like as an Indigenous person, I'm not satisfied with these systems, so I want to change
Mhm.
them. So yes, that's all true. But like, especially like, frankly, any one of us was likely to be seen as that, because we're not going to accept the status quo. So if you're doing that work, when you find someone who's willing to move with you, that's your person. It sort of doesn't matter what political party, like it doesn't, like, because you're going to disagree with all of them on some factors anyway.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
if you find one who's willing to move in the direction you need to move things, then that's your person. You move with them. When you get there, if when they stop being willing to move, you will find someone else at that new spot who's willing to move to the next destination, and that's how you build.
Wow.
And those that are unwilling, meaning those that are like, I want the status quo or whatever, your job is not to convince those people.
Mm.
Your job actually is, once you start moving with the willing, your job is to accept the unwilling once they start to follow, and not hold the grudge that they weren't willing to move with you at the first. Because the truth is, if you are going to
Wow.
move things, you're going to move them with the willing, and the unwilling, once they start moving, those folks tend to fall, they come into it, because they see which the direction
Mhm.
it's going. And so this advice has always been super important to me in terms of like how I've approached leadership and change making, and viewing it. And it allows, I think for us, it also allows us that, like, for Indigenous folks in these spaces, you're not always going to find the ideal person who believes in every single thing you're talking about. And the point is, you don't need to. You need to find the person who's willing to move with you in this specific way, and you move with them, and you move with this person, and so that's
Wow.
the energy. And then the last part I would say is, take care of yourself.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
um, it is important, and I should say, given how we started this talk, Pam, it is important that we give back. Like, of course it is. This is how we're all taught. It is also important to not give all of yourself back, if you understand what I mean. Like,
Mhm.
like
Mhm.
we don't owe even our communities, as needy and as in need as they may be, and as fulfilling as they are when they fill us up, and as much as we want to fill them up, we are not. This is not a solo performance.
No.
We are a choir. We sing. If you're in the drum circle, you're in the circle. You're not. It's not a solo drum performance. Okay, which means, if at times, in order to be part of this whole thing, you need to pull your drum back, you need to
Yeah.
be quiet, be quiet. It's okay. someone
Wow.
someone else will pick up the beat, will carry the drum. If you need to take care of yourself, because one of the hard lessons I've had is I did not take care of myself for a long time, and it all caught up to me in really bad ways, physical, mental, all sorts of stuff.
Mhm.
And I don't want to regret what I did, so I don't.
Mhm.
What I do want to hope is that Um, and certainly what I try to do is not impose, just because I did it this way means you have to. In fact, I would suggest don't do it this way. There's a gentler way. I didn't know how to do it. I didn't have those tools. There's a gentler way for yourself. I mean, and I don't mean you have to be gentle always, because I
Yeah.
haven't always been
Yeah.
gentle with the colonial world. Um, but you should try to be for you, because I think, what I would say, Pam, is like I've gone through some health scares, both mental and physical, in the last couple of years, and one of the things that drove them home is that if I want to be all about community service, well, I have to be here to be all about community service. If I'm not here, then I'm not serving anyone. And so, and if to be here, I need to make more space for things that are away from here. If, for example, I have to not be on social media, which I'm not really anymore, then that's fine. And if I have to golf, which I do a lot these days, then I'll golf, which is like the most colonial, silly thing on the planet to do. I know you ride your motorcycle, right?
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
some people would go, like my mom, Pam, would go, it's very dangerous, very
Yeah.
dangerous
Yes. Yes. Yes.
to ride that motorcycle. Everyone has an accident. Exactly what
Yeah.
my mom would say. To such a,
Yeah.
thus, I don't have a motorcycle. But like, we need those things. It's okay for that. I didn't think it was okay. Like, I really thought I had to be in it like all the time, 24 hours a day, forever. I thought I had to be in it for my career, for our community, for all of it. And I could still do that. I would live a lot shorter life.
Yeah.
I'd be gone a lot. I could be gone already if I'd kept that pace up. So my last advice would be, and it is very much an old guy talking to young people, and I know how that goes. And to these young person, you can absolutely disregard this. It's fine, because as an elder often said to me, like, to a younger me, I wouldn't have listened to older me. So, like, I get it.
Mhm.
But there is a way, and I would urge you to, like, just, even if it's just a little bit more, you take care of yourself. Do that little bit more. The anecdote I often say is, like, the Roman Empire, it took like several hundred years for it to collapse. Like, it did not happen overnight. Like, it was a long, people had families, had whole lives and family trees, and like whole things happened while that was happening, while this sort of big thing. Like, it's okay, like, to
Mhm.
be an activist, to be trying to change the world. Yes, do all of that, but make sure, and I don't mean in a sort of selfish capitalist way, I mean in a very humble sort of way.
Yeah.
We are humans. We are not that powerful. The one of our teachings is, in fact, we're sort of the weakest one on the planet.
Mhm.
Allow that to mean we take care of ourselves and each other, that we allow the space for everyone to take care of themselves, that the way we move through, I would love it if we could be kinder to ourselves, even
Yeah.
when we disagree and when we're not. And I haven't always been kind to those I disagree with. And I do regret those sorts of things. But it's also like, the first part of it is to be kinder to myself. And so,
Yeah.
um, and especially for Indigenous people, where colonialism has taught us all sorts of ways to think about ourselves, ways to think about our situation, ways to think, to ground ourselves again, and as much as we can, in like the place and the here and the now, and that there isn't, the way you are, whatever you are, Anishinaabe, Mi'kmaq, whatever it is, that's the way to do it. You're doing it right now. That's it.
Mhm.
And we were always contemporary people. So the way we are now
Yeah.
is the way we would have viewed ourselves. You know what I mean? Like, we're not out of step with that. And so, um, as much as we can, it's so hard to say, try to gain comfort in a most discomforting time, but it's like, and comfort is maybe not the right phrase.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
right. It's not the right word. It's more like, just keep in mind the energies, and that's not the right word either. But like I'm
Yeah,
sure there's an
yeah.
Anishinaabe way for me to say what I'm trying to say, and goddamn colonialism took the language, so I don't know. But I'm just saying that keep in
Yeah.
mind that we are beings. That human being is a two-word thing. That nurture the being, allow the doing to flow from you being as connected to your being as you can, and don't, because I did a lot of stuff that was not connected, and I would say that's the stuff that hurt me. And so like
Mhm.
try to mitigate that as much as you can. And the one again where I find hope with young people, like I just got to spend a week in Banff with a bunch of young Indigenous artists, mostly young Indigenous artists. Some of my contemporaries were there, but the mostly, and maybe you've experienced this, Pam, too, because you've been at this for so long. But I'm starting to meet artists and young people who are coming up in a world different. Do you know what I mean? That they're
Yes,
coming
yes.
up in a way like they're sort of where my cohort dreamed that we could have been. Do you know what I mean? Like we and now I'm seeing these like young people, and they're like, "Oh my God, you're right there! Like you're already
Yeah.
so far advanced beyond where we were at your age," and I'm so gratified by that. It's what maybe the most exciting thing about this stage of my life is meeting these young people who are moving in the spaces that we fought so hard for,
Yes.
and they're moving unburdened by that particular struggle. And that's like, yes, do that all the
Yes.
time. Yes, you're going to have to struggle to create more space, I
Mhm.
grant you, but keep that up. And that gives me such hope, because I'm not seeing folks who are like, oh, I don't
Yeah.
belong. Like I'm seeing, no, because this is space created for us. It's like,
Yeah.
yes, that's the thing. And that is how we will heal, both me, because that's very healing for me to see, because it makes it all worth it. But also, this is how our communities will heal, right? Is that the stuff that was really painful for one generation isn't, or is less for the following, and so on.
Yeah.
So that,
Yeah.
and that just proves that we've begun that work. So that would be my advice, and enjoy your time here, as hard as that may be, or as a struggle as all these systems make that. Do enjoy it, because that is the whole
Yeah.
purpose, and be in solidarity, as I will always be with you.
Wow. I think this is going to go down as one of my favorite podcasts. That whole last part about the advice and guidance, that was like, hey, these are things I've told other people. Why am I still not following it? Like, you got to stop and check and see where you are, and just, so I love this. You've reminded me of all these things. And just the way you put it, the way that, the advice that you got, so important, so inspiring. Everything you do is very, very inspiring. I love how you change and grow over time. I can't wait for your second book or any other project that you're working on. Very, very exciting. And thank you to all the listeners who listen to the podcast, who take time to think about this, use it in your classrooms. Thank you to all the YouTube viewers who also use it as a resource to learn. Thank you to the YouTube closed caption readers who also take the time to engage with what we're doing and in your own specific ways, and use it and learn from it. And if you've listened to these, I don't know, 160 podcast episodes, 160 different voices, they're all coming from different backgrounds. They all have different things to say. We don't all agree, but we're all kind of heading towards the good space, the place that our ancestors wanted. So thank you. Thank you so, so much for taking your time.
Thank you so much, Pam. It was great.
Till next time, keep living a warrior life. Walalia.